I'm David Clayton, and this is the Way of Beauty podcast, conversations on Catholic faith and culture.
I'm here with Paul Jernberg. This is episode 40 of the Way of Beauty podcast, and this is the seventh conversation I've had with Paul, and we're going to discuss this week the contrast between the ideal and the real, how we put these things into practice in the parishes. I think all the things we've been discussing about sacred music. So, Paul, great to see you again.
Good to see you, David.
Why don't you just summarize what we've done so far, if you can do that in six talks in a minute and a half, and then we go on and think about how we actually deal with this in practice.
Right. So we started out by talking about what sacred music is, and then we talked a lot about what the vision of sacred music is that the Church presents to us, and which we have as an inheritance from our traditions. And we've talked a lot about the ideal as far as what that should mean in our parishes and our communities. And we've talked a little bit too about how to implement that. But I'd like to go a little bit farther with that idea of implementation today, because I think for a lot of people, when they hear about this ideal and they compare it to the real in their particular situation, they might think it's just crazy. There's no way that I could go from where I'm at or from where we're at to this ideal. So that's what I'd like to speak about at length today, is just looking at very real situations that people find themselves in and see how to move forward towards this, towards the vision of renewal that we're given by the Church.
Great. This is important because in the end, it doesn't matter how great the ideals are. If we can't go from if the gap is too great, what's the point? And we
That's
can
right.
despair, I think. So
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I'd like to start out by emphasizing the need for the ideal. First of all, just sort of recapping some of the things we've talked about, because just as a navigator needs to know his destination, if you're going to sail across the ocean, you need to know very clearly where you're planning to land. In a similar way, if we do not have that strong sense of the ideal, and if we don't cultivate that and think about it and pray about it and work on these principles, we'll be lost at sea.
Mm.
We need to chart a course, and we need to refer to our destination and our charted course along the way in order to have hope to arrive. Now, and also so what is this? What is this destination? Well, we've been talking about the different principles. It's a destination that is this full, authentic renewal of sacred music in our parishes and our communities. And it's based on principles, sound first principles. And some of these we've talked about. We talked about holiness, beauty, and universality. This was Pius X who expounded on this in his teaching in the early 20th century, and how that is very fundamental to our whole thinking about sacred music. We've talked about organic continuity with our traditions, that musicians, church musicians and priests, they need to be connected. They need to have some kind of strong formation in our great traditions of sacred music. We've talked about the centrality of the sacred text of the liturgy, that sacred music is primarily about clothing this text rather than creating new sets of songs and lyrics. Or it's really, and the fact that sacred text is essentially a gift that we received from Christ and developed by the Church. We've talked about the primacy of the human voice, because as sacred music is primarily about singing the sacred text, then clearly the human voice is really at the heart of everything we do, not excluding instruments and the skillful use of instruments, of course, but that we need to always get back to the primacy of the human voice. And we've talked also about the need for resonance And that means that when we sit, when we choose and sing and perform, you might say, sacred music in the context of the liturgy, it's very important that what we do as church musicians has the capacity to truly resonate in the hearts and minds of those who are listening, those who are worshiping. And if we don't have that resonance, we're not connecting, and we need to connect with people. So these are some of the first principles, and we can contrast these with what often is, what seems to often be another set of first principles on the part of pastors and music directors, which are often oriented towards, you might say, pleasing the most people possible and avoiding conflict with the most people possible. If we take that, if we can't go beyond, now that's not bad, of course, it's good to please people. But if we get that confused with these other more essential principles, we will ultimately be lost, and we will not find our way forward. So again, it's not wrong to please people, but we really need to be rooted in these others that I mentioned.
I don't want to knock you off your track, but I think this is true. This is not just true in music. This is true in regard to pretty much every aspect of the faith that can communicate. We want to present it in the best way possible, in the way that is going to actually touch people's hearts, but not at the expense of what is fundamental to it. The goal is not simply to attract people. The goal is to attract people to the faith. And if you undermine the faith in the process, then it doesn't matter how many connections you make, it's not working.
Right. That's right, David. And I would say not only to attract them to the faith, which, I mean, what I'm going to say is maybe essentially the same thing, but in the context of the liturgy, to draw them into the mystery of the liturgy.
Yes.
Which is at the heart of the faith, you might say. The act of loving God, this privileged moment of entering into this loving adoration of God and communion with Him, is really essential to the liturgy. So anyway, again, I'm talking again about the ideal, which we absolutely need to keep in our sights. However, having established that firmly, if it can be very dangerous, you might say even fatal in the life of a parish, if a pastor or music director, in order to pursue this ideal, doesn't exercise prudence and patience well. And just as a navigator needs to deal wisely with all the conditions and obstacles that come along the way, so do priests and church musicians need to exercise this kind of wisdom as they go forward. That means that we absolutely need to take into account the present reality of a given parish, and to see it realistically, to know it well, and then to prayerfully decide with all our powers of discernment, spiritual and human, how we can move forward step by step in the right direction towards our goal. And another thing is that when, and now just a couple examples. So let's say that we've talked about the propers of the Mass as well as the ordinary. Generally, the ordinary of the Mass is sung or spoken, every Mass you go to. Rather rarely, the propers of the Mass are spoken or sung. And they're sometimes spoken, but often not sung, most often not sung. If, let's say, someone becomes very enthusiastic about introducing the propers in a Mass, but let's say they don't really have the singers to pull it off, or let's say the setting they use is not particularly inspiring or engaging, or that, and let's say they do that without the proper foundation, well, they might be doing something that is hypothetically correct, but which in a particular situation, at a particular moment, actually is counterproductive.
Mm.
And it might even push people away from the whole idea if it's not well done.
I'm reminded here, this may be something that others have heard, but I heard this first from Father Frank Phillips at St. John Cantius.
Yes.
Now he knows about how to turn a parish around, if anyone.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Now, and what he said in the talk that I heard him give was that he, first of all, didn't change anything for a year. So, I mean, he's speaking as the priest, not as the choir director. So that might be a different thing. But the point that he made with regard to changes, he said, don't change anything unless you can either do without it altogether, or unless you're going to replace it with something better.
Yes.
In other words, and what he seemed to be saying is, first of all, pick your battles, and go for the soft spots first, and there are some things that really are worth fighting over and really are worth losing a few people for.
Yes.
But you choose those things carefully.
That's right.
And you have to weigh up the importance of it. And of course, what I understand from what you're saying is that the importance of it is, it's not just the ideal that we have in our mind, but it's the practicality of how we introduce it as well.
Exactly.
It has to be weighed up.
Exactly. And I think that St. John Cantius is an amazing example of just this very step-by-step approach, which seems almost to church musician who really is enthused about the renewal of sacred music, it might even seem so painfully patient that almost, incomprehensible, to hear how they went so slowly, but it was very effective in the long run. And I have not been exposed firsthand. I was there once to one of their masses long ago, but I've heard very, very good things about their program. It's very impressive and inspiring.
Yeah, it reminded me when I walked in. So they have this is a church for people who are listening in Chicago, and so it's a story not just of the music, but the whole of everything, really.
Right,
So,
right.
And I'm doing my best, excuse me, to remember the details, but so I'm making mistakes for people who know about this. Then I apologize. But from what I understand, he arrived 30 years ago, perhaps more, and this was a huge sort of empty basilica with the rain coming in, and a congregation at one of the first masses he celebrated of, I don't know, about 40 aged Poles, I think, Polish Americans, and then within 20 years they had 1,500 families registered at this church, and everything was focused on the presentation of the beautiful liturgy and beautiful music and the orthodoxy, fully acknowledging Vatican II. So they have the extraordinary form and the ordinary form, done similar spirit, an authentic spirit of the liturgy, I would say, yes, and when I went in there, it reminded me in the feeling of it of the Brompton Oratory. So I first went in, I'm going to say, about a dozen years ago, something like that. And the canons regular, that's the order of priest he has there. So there might be, I don't know, a dozen priests there or something like that as well. They're wandering around in black cassocks. There's this, you can smell the incense from the last mass sort of lingering on. Lots of candles around. There's beautiful art. There's even the floors are set out in geometric patterns. He's thought very carefully about this as an integrated whole. So yeah.
Great. And you mentioned that putting together both the ordinary form and extraordinary form there at St. John Cantius, and we need to come back to that later, because a lot of the things we're talking about are applicable not only in the ordinary form. We're talking mainly about the ordinary form right now, but actually a lot of the things we're talking about can be and need to be applied to those who are celebrating the extraordinary form as well. We'll need to leave that for a little bit later, because that sort of has a whole different set of parameters and needs.
Yes.
But yeah, well, I promise to come back to that at a later point.
Good.
But maybe not right now. So, and I think another thing to keep in mind too, there's several parishes that I'm aware of that seem to be success stories, but which do not incorporate a lot of the principles we've talked about.
Right.
So that's a set of challenges in itself, and I'm going to talk about those in a moment too. So what I'd like to do now, David, is to look at 3 or 4 actual examples of parish situations.
Okay.
And these are all parishes that I know about. I'm not going to say exactly where they are or what the name is, but I think each one of these presents very interesting challenges.
Okay. Let's go right on. Let's go straight on to those now. I think we've got time just to cover those. So that's great. Let's talk about these.
And this is, I thrive on this kind of thing. I mean, I think this is where the rubber hits the road, so to speak, as far as looking at, the most challenging situations and saying, how in the world can renewal take place? And of course, we know that you need to have the pastor who is on board. That's a given. But we're going to assume right now that the pastor is on board, and we're going to trust that he is. And then later on, we'll talk about what do you do when the pastor's not really open. We can talk about that as well. But right now, we're going to assume that he is, and that he's got real integrity and is really pursuing his vocation as a priest very well. So the first situation I'd like to talk about is a parish I know about in the southern United States. And this is a rather amazing place. It's a very large retirement community nearby. But each weekend there are many thousands of people that come to Mass at this parish. They have, it seems like they are really thriving in an amazing way, in that they have people coming to weekend masses, to daily masses. The income they get from their offering each week is staggering. They exceed their budgetary needs on a regular basis, and so they're able to grow. They're able to do all sorts of things. However, the music that they have, the primary kind of music they have, is what we might call praise and worship. And the people seem to really love it. A friend of mine described it in this way, that the music is very similar. If you, I don't know if you're familiar with Joel Osteen. He's a televangelist.
Vaguely, yeah. I mean, yeah.
I'm not very familiar with his work. I've seen him, from time to time, little snippets here and there. Yeah. But his program, they have very engaging music that you might call praise and worship, and everybody's involved with it. So that's the kind of music that they really emphasize in this parish. So my friend asked me, well, what do you say to people like that? It's working really well. They've got more money than they know what to do with. And so that's the first parish I want to talk about when we come back to it there. But just to keep that in mind. Okay. Thriving, money making, people are happy, very engaging praise and worship music. What do we say about that? Where are they? Where are they going? What would I recommend? What would the pastor do to go forward if he thinks there's a need? Or, well, if we see a need for renewal there, do we see their need? And if so, where do we go?
I'm going to suggest to you, Paul, why don't you go on and do that now? And I know you've got about 4 of these to do, but you've so intrigued me. I want to hear the answer. I don't want to wait. So let's do them one by one. And if we have to cut off and then wait till next week for 3 and 4, that'll be fine. Because
okay, the only problem with that, David, is that I have a whole set of principles that apply to all of them. So the things actually, what I'm going to do is to present a whole group of things that everybody can do, and then they need to be, of course, they need to be fine-tuned to each parish situation. So
here's what I suggest: go through the principles, and then we'll deal with the particulars one by one, or else.
Okay, that sounds great.
This one example, which you describe.
Okay, that sounds great. Right.
The general principles through this one example.
Right.
Whichever you think might be the easiest to do.
Okay. So here's just to say parenthetically first, that whenever you have what seems to be a successful situation in terms of people being inspired, happy, growing, we have to be very careful to build on success and to replace, if we're going to replace something, we need to do so that's going to be able to be perceived as a step in the right direction and forward, rather than simply a taking away.
Okay.
If we simply start pruning as if we're going to get rid of all the bad things, and if we don't have positive things that you might say can compete and even overcome the other, then you're going to be in a predicament. But there are certain things, the things I'm going to list now I would assert that all these things are not only necessary, but they're fundamental, and that without these things I'm going to list, we're somewhat doomed. Okay, and I've got about 7 of them here.
Okay, go through them one by one. I'm going to make a note, and we'll come back to these, I'm sure. Yeah.
And I'm thinking about this particular parish right now. I'm thinking about all these different parishes, but we'll come back to this thriving parish in a moment, because so the first thing is to cultivate the proper dispositions among the priests, among the church musicians, and the laity. Now, you might say, well, these people already have good dispositions, and that might, in which case, great. I'm not pointing the finger at anybody or saying they don't have the proper dispositions, but I'm saying this is something that, as a general rule, everybody needs to grow in, and that needs to be called to grow in. Priests need to call, or bishops need to lead by word and example. Priests also need to lead their parishioners by word and example. And what I'm thinking about with the dispositions, we can talk about a whole set of them, and they're very closely related to the virtues. The ones that I see are the most important in the liturgy are those of humility and profound reverence.
A sense of dignity and bearing appropriate to this. And whatever we might say, we don't want to point fingers at a particular parish, but let's talk about this hypothetical praise and worship parish that's indistinguishable from an evangelical. What we can say is that they do not have the proper disposition. They really are indistinguishable from an evangelical gathering. There's something wrong with the disposition. That is why it's indistinguishable.
That's right. That's right. So, but here's the thing, and this is, you might say, the amazing potential for the priest, is that when the priest is holy, and when his holiness radiates, it has a capacity to sort of make up for a lot of other things. Now, this has been my own experience. I've seen it happen even in a situation where you say the music, and I'm not talking about a strong praise and worship necessarily, but I've experienced situations where the priest is so given to Christ and is so much exemplifying the person of Christ by his own life and by his own approach to the liturgy, that even though it doesn't negate the need for music renewal, it does have the power to draw. There's a great power there.
Yeah, but what we're saying is that it does so despite the music, not because of it.
That's right.
And so if the music were in harmony with that and we're clothing it, it would do so even more powerful.
That's right, absolutely.
Yeah.
But so this is just the first of 7 points, David. So,
good. Yeah.
So, but this, you see, when is the last time you heard a priest talk about cultivating the proper dispositions? Maybe you've heard it more than I have.
Well, actually, I've only ever heard it once, and that was my pastor at St. Elias, Father Sebastian, talking to me, telling me as cantor to sort out my disposition. But he was right. So lean against the back wall, stand up, this sort of thing.
Yeah.
But that's the only occasion, and I was struck by it actually, because that he should give it. In fact, it was the whole of the choir,
right,
who were moved to the front, and we got a very good talk on how we should conduct ourselves.
You see, this needs to be spread, I think, very much. Yeah. Interestingly, I think for me, the strongest message I ever heard was not with words, but I was music director in an inner city parish in Chicago years back, and it was a normal mass, so to speak. But there was a whole group of pilgrims that arrived at the church. It was the Church of St. Francis of Assisi in the west side of Chicago's inner city, and they had relics of St. Francis there. There's this whole group, I don't know, maybe 30, 40, 50 pilgrims. I think they're Hispanic. And they all came in walking on their knees up the stairs to the church and into the church. And I've rarely experienced such a sense of transformation of a liturgy from you might say, the power of the disposition that they radiated, and that it was somewhat contagious even. It had a real effect. So again, it doesn't negate the need for changing the music. And it might seem like I'm getting off topic here for a moment, but this is one of the things that everybody can work on.
But what it does do is point to reasons why going back to this hypothetical parish, these other things might be in place, you see. It doesn't mean because the music's awful, everything is. So, which is supporting what you're saying. That I'm also, but when everything is in harmony, working together, and it's immensely powerful. So again, my experience of the Brompton area, I keep coming back to again. I understood that there was something special about the host held aloft.
Yes.
Mainly because of the attitude of the people around me towards it.
Yes.
Without having any, I didn't even know it was Catholic when I went in there. I didn't know what I was looking at.
Right.
But I understood that this was important because of their body language. Is the way I always described it. What it is what you're describing.
Exactly. Yes. So anyway, that's the first point that I have. The second point I want to bring up is that, and I think most priests I've worked with recently, at least, are pretty much aware of this. You need to cleanse the liturgy immediately of anything that is obviously heretical, heterodox, or irreverent.
Yeah.
So that's something that cannot be dealt with on a gradual basis.
Yeah.
It's so insidious and it's so harmful. And there are hymns and so many hymnals that really are going in that direction. And there are things that priests sometimes do, or that people sometimes do, that that are doing that we have to address.
I'm gonna give you an example here. I was sitting in this office. There's a school next door to me, which 2 years ago was a Catholic school. I think a middle school. They're young children. I don't come from America. I didn't go through the American education.
Right.
I don't know what the sort of various grades and things are, but so there are. I'm guessing about 10, 11 or something. Most of the kids, and I could hear their music lessons. You know, they would have a sort of joint assembly where someone would play a piano, lead them in song, and they were singing at this supposedly Catholic school John Lennon's Imagine.
Oh no.
Including Imagine There's No Religion, and Imagine and they would, honestly, this is, now the school ceased to be Catholic
right
a year later, and it's now there's an Islamic school
right
to the property.
And probably you and I and many other people can cite all sorts of things like that are crazy. I once went to a midnight mass in France where the organist, this was the Christmas midnight mass, the organist was playing a medley of Elvis Presley tunes. Seriously, for Christmas. Now, I mean, that just seems so far out. There's probably most of us don't, experience something like that. But there's all sorts of crazy things that have gone on. And
yeah, I've seen an icon of Jimi Hendrix as well. Which, anyway, back to the point.
Yeah. So anyway, I think we have to be. These are non-negotiables as far as orthodoxy and reverence.
Yeah.
That need to be cleansed from the liturgy. And then that's the second. The third has to do with team building, you might say. In other words, if a pastor is coming into a parish now, he might already have a music director and a team of musicians, and he needs to work with them. And if they're on board with the destination we've been describing, that's great. If they're not, he needs to lead them there. Or if they're not willing to go there, there's a problem there that needs to be solved, because you need to find the right musicians who are going to be willing to work together for this great goal of renewal, and who see the need. And if they don't see the need, they need to be open to be led to that vision, so to speak. And this can be, of course, very sensitive, because there's lots and lots of people working in the realm of sacred music who have been educated or have been formed with the principles of this contemporary Catholic repertoire, so to speak. And many, or if not most, might seem to think that we don't really need renewal. Or if we need renewal, it's more a question of getting better musicians. But as far as changing the music, they may not see that. So, but really, in order to go forward, you have to have the right people you're working with. Otherwise, it's going to be a constant conflict. And if we can be clear in stating our principles and so forth, then we can go forward. If there's a person who just doesn't fit, they need to understand it's not fitting. We need to go forward. This can be difficult sometimes. There's not a superabundance of qualified church musicians out there, but it's better to have good amateurs helping you, whose heart is really in it, rather than having so-called professionals who really don't understand the needs or what needs to be done. So that's the third point. The fourth is the way in which a pastor treats his music director. And this is, if there is a professional music director. I bring this point up because it might not seem at first to be such a crucial point, but from long years of experience, I can tell you that this is a real that can be a real big hindrance to this process of renewal. And that is a parish music director needs to be seen primarily as a facilitator rather than somebody who does everything all the time. And that might seem obvious, but it's not obvious to a lot of people. In fact, there's been, so what do I mean? There are all sorts of people, generally speaking, in my experience at least, you're surrounded by all sorts of people with talent, who are musical talented and who are eager to help. Let's say I have a fine organist in the parish who is able to help, or a cantor that will do a good job. Oftentimes, what we see today in parishes is that if someone's hired as a music director, if they don't do all these functions all the time, they feel at risk of losing their salary or having their salary pruned down. And in fact, it's very destructive. It's a very counterproductive thing, because, another thing that we see today is that in different dioceses, I've seen this, that there's a movement in some places to insist that the music director put in his 40 hours or her 40 hours each week, even if it means stuffing envelopes or doing this or that. It's this whole mentality that a music director should be treated like anybody else. You better be there in the office all these hours. But really, upon reflection, and as far as the nature of a musician and the nature of the job, generally speaking, that is really destructive. But first of all, the morale of everybody, and of the nature. It goes against the nature of what it means to be a musician and a music director. Now, so I could talk a lot more about this one, and people might have questions about it, but the music director really does, it has a lot of work to do, and it has a lot of really important work to do. But his or her job needs to be to make it happen, and to bring in all sorts of other people to help make it happen. So it's a true team effort, rather than being the one who has to be there all the time doing, or most of the time doing all being a functionary, so to speak. And it might be worth coming back to that later. And so the pastor also, in this regard, if he finds a good music director, a good organist, he really needs to take care of him or her as far as being aware of the many sacrifices they make. And because as a church musician, yes, you've embraced this vocation, but it means being away from your family, being there every Saturday, every Sunday, every wedding, every funeral, whatever. When other people have time off, you are the most busy. So this is not meant to be a complaint, but rather to help remind people the great challenge of being a music director today.
Okay. I'm going to, how many, we've got 7 of these.
We've got 3 more points here.
Okay, let's go through these fairly quickly, and then what we'll do is we'll come back in the next one and introduce them into the various examples.
Okay, sounds great.
Yeah, okay.
Great. So the next one is that, and again, all of these have to do with their universal principles, their steps that everybody can take. The priest needs to cultivate unity on the team, and not only in the teamwork in the ways we normally think of developing a good teamwork, but also in terms of unity in the liturgy itself. So he needs to avoid this sense of the musicians are up there, the priest is down here, or they do their thing, I do my thing. No, it needs to be a unified whole in order to cultivate that kind of focus on God that the liturgy is meant to be.
So I have a picture here of the body of Christ. So each is fulfilling his role, and when he or she is doing that, they are fully participating in the liturgy in that role. It's
That's
not.
right.
So the musician is worshipping as much as the layperson or the
Excellent.
priest.
Yes,
Each has his role in what is ultimately the body of Christ.
that's right. That's
Yeah.
right. And we've touched on this a little bit before, and
Yeah.
there's a lot to that. Okay, number 6, and now we sort of get back to our ideal, but again, there needs to be a course charted towards the ideal. And in order to do this, we need to strategize, plan well, so step by step, we're able to implement things in a way that is inspiring, that is resonating with people, and you might say convincing them that what we're offering is a step forward and not merely, you might say, correct, or not merely following the rules, although those things are important, but no, people need to sense that they are being led forward. And so a plan to go towards the ideal. And then the 7th thing, what I would say as well, is providing opportunities that are not outside of the main mass, let's say on Sunday, but it might be a Sunday night liturgy, or it might be a concert, but providing opportunities for parishioners to experience the beauty and the greatness of our traditions in a way that, again, that resonates within them and that inspires them. So it could be a fully sung mass, like the one we recently did here, where we invite people and in an exceptional way, they get sort of an immersion in something that's really great, and that they see that these experiences then help expand the vision of parishioners and everybody to see that there's something out there that is worthy of this great pursuit of renewal.
That's interesting. My model, if you like, of the liturgy is always formed by the best places that I've seen. The picture, again,
Yes.
they come back to the Brompton Oratory or somewhere like St. John Cantius, and even when we're doing it, when I'm participating in something somewhere else, shall we say,
yeah,
what I have in mind is that experience. I want it to be humble, to be a participation in what I have in my mind as the ideal, which is being suggested to be more by those grand events.
Yes.
The picture, I mean that in the right way, so that they set out that ideal, which
yes.
Is so that on other occasions, so even when we're singing, so last night, for example, we had Vespers where I am, and we have a group of men that just get together in this place where I live.
Yes.
And we set up an icon corner and we sing Vespers, and it's modified chant for English. But what I have in mind, in my imagination, is that this is a participation in what I saw at the Brompton Oratory.
Right.
Because I know what the ideal is, and I want everything in some way to be connected to that, however humble it might be.
Right, and I think the more people in a given parish who have those kinds of experiences, like you had, the more people, and especially the people who are working together in the music program, that's going to really help feed that fire within them to go forward.
I can see that. That makes sense, and I hadn't actually thought that you can you can put more emphasis on a few of these occasions. To fire the enthusiasm, people to experience it, and then people will then see how the plain vanilla mass, if I can call it that, is actually trying to be a participation in this, and we're trying to raise the general standard of all of it towards that.
That's right.
Okay. That's great. Well, I think you might wish to sort of conclude in some way, but I think that's a good place to stop, and we'll come back next week.
That sounds very good.
Okay. Well, Paul Jernberg, Thank you very much. Next week, what we're going to do is come back to that thriving Joel Osteen parish, Joel Osteen parish in the south that you mentioned. But we're going to actually see how this applies in typical situations. So you've set out these principles, and we'll discuss that in more detail next week. So, Paul, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, David.
You've been listening to the Way of Beauty podcast, conversations on Catholic faith and culture. If you enjoyed this episode, then please give us a 5-star review on iTunes. This will help others to find it too. Also, if you're interested in delving more deeply into the material that we discuss, you can do a course at the Pontifex University website. That's pontifex.university.